Hello, welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn a couple things. We're going to first learn how to write a Python script to look at a TOML file, and then we're going to do some data validation to make sure the required fields that we care about exist within that TOML file. Okay? To start, what we're going to do is create a new file, and let's call this validation.py. The first thing we're going to do is import some libraries. The first one is TOML, and the second one is sys. And we'll get into why we need both of those throughout this video. So the first side of a business is to figure out how to import a TOML file, okay? And to do this, we want to use a known good file. So we are going to go into the detection rules GitHub, and we're going to grab one of those Windows rules again. Okay, now we should have this collection _email _PowerShell _exchange _mailbox.toml. Bit of a mouthful. And what I'm going to do to make this a little easier to work with is call this alert _example.toml. And we're just going to make sure that it is in the same path as our Python script here. Okay, going back to our validation.py. So what we need to do is to read this file into some sort of variable that we can manipulate. And we're going to put the file name as a variable called file here. Okay, so essentially what we're doing here is reading that file in, and we're calling that read data TOML. And then we're loading that TOML data in through the TOML library and putting that in a variable called alert. And what this will let us do is read some of the data. So let's launch this. And it's not formatted, but if you kind of glance over this for a second here, you can see the metadata table here, and then the associated fields contained within the metadata field. We go back to alert example.toml here. You can see it's lining up pretty nicely. You can see that's reading in that file and it's storing it in this alert variable that we can work with. But the big question here is, how do you parse through the data? And by parse, I mean, let's say you want to pick out one particular piece of the data and print only that piece of information out. So looking at that alert, let's say we want to print out the name of the alert, okay? And what this requires, whether you're using TOML or YAML or any kind of file format like that, is some kind of loop where you can iterate over the data. If we look at it from this perspective, okay, when we talked about tables, think of tables as a container. So we have one container here and another container that goes all the way down, essentially to the bottom of the document, okay? To help show that in Python, what we can do is say for table and alert. And by table, I mean these sections here. Print the table. And we can see our script pipes out the metadata and the rule table. Okay, so it's kind of nice once we load the data in, you can see how the Python library is smart enough to know that these are two distinct pieces of data. So what we want to do next is to iterate even further. So we're going to say for field, and the alert table, print the field. you can see all the fields that are listed in the alert. So just looking at the metadata, you can see that it's saying creation date all the way down to updated date. And to help illustrate this, what I'm going to do is comment this out. We're going to be a bit more explicit, okay? This is looping over everything. Let's say we have 100 different tables in our alert document, as a hypothetical, and we only want that rule section. We could also say something like this. And if we run this, let me make sure this is big enough here. If we run this, you can see just the pieces of data that is in that specific rule table. Okay. So what this code is doing here is iterating over every table, but if we want to be specific, we can do that. Now that we know how to iterate over our data, how do we make sure that the required fields are present in our document? So looking back at our required fields, you can see some items here. And what we're going to do is to put these fields as an array within our script. So we're going to get rid of this. And let's call this required fields. And we're going to just grab these. Put them each in single quotes. We have a bit of a roadblock here. So what happens if we want to make a threshold alert and that requires a different field? And we're going to solve that problem in a second here, but let's at least make sure that we can write some code that iterates over the data and make sure that these fields are present. So what we can do is to create another array. We're going to call this array present fields. And similar to the code we wrote before, we want to iterate over our alert data and account for all the fields that are present. So I'm actually going to take this code that we wrote, insert it down in the bottom here. And essentially what we're doing, instead of just printing the data out, we're putting the data in the array. So what does this look like? Okay. We now have an array that contains every individual field that's in our alert data across all the tables. Now, what do we do if a field does not exist in this required field section? Okay. So let's say, for example, we want to get rid of name. And we need to know that name is the field that's missing because it's a required field here. So what we're going to do is create yet another array called missing fields. And the idea here is that we're going to loop over our required fields array and see if each of those values exist in the present fields array. So we're essentially just doing a comparison between the two. And to do that, we can say for field in required fields, to walk you through the logic here, we're looping over each item here. We're saying for each of those, if that field does not exist in present fields, which is populated based off of our previous loop, which we saw here, append that field to the missing fields array. And what we're going to do to help illustrate this is to print all these out. All right, so now we have all our arrays here. And if I run this, you can see the 3 arrays that are present. So we have the required field array, we have the present field array, and then we have what is missing from the required fields in the present fields. So now that we have the data, how do we want to present it? And that's always a fun consideration here. If missing fields, and what this means in Python is we're essentially saying if any data exists in missing fields, we want to print something. And this is essentially our error statement. And we want it to be as verbose as possible, but also straight to the point. Thinking back to the elastic detection validation process from a couple of videos ago, we want to avoid that problem where it's dumping too much error code. So we're going to make sure ours is as concise and straight to the point as possible. So what we can do is add a little text statement here. We're going to add the file name. We're going to add a colon just to give it some formatting. And then we're going to add in missing fields as a string. For demonstration purposes, let me run this without that so you can see the error. Python doesn't like if you're trying to concatenate lists, which is another name for an array. You need the string. So you can convert different types of data by doing something like this. And if we run this, you can see the following fields do not exist in an alert_example.toml, and then the field name. And we can see I have a little typo here. Here, rerun that. So here's it better formatted here. And this is an example of what I would give to, let's say, one of my junior engineers so they know exactly what file and what field they need to go add or edit or change. Okay. So at this point, we have a pretty simple but very usable data validator for fields. The big question now, to make this more complicated, is what do we do if the type's different? Because the fields are going to change. So to do that, we're going to have to do some if statements to check what the rule type is, and then have a different set of required fields for each of those alert types. Okay. So what we're going to do is break this part out. And we can throw that here for now. So we can start with the first one, query. Query requires all of these fields. So we can say alert rule type is equal to query. Set these as the required fields. Okay. So if we look in our alert example, we can see rule refers to this chunk, and then we're honing in on type, which is this field here, and it's EQL. And EQL is actually pretty particular because if I bring over the documentation over here, if we go into the documentation, scroll down to event correlation rules, which is what EQL is, it requires the language field. Okay. So looking back in our documentation, does the language field exist? We could say yes. But if we look in our script, the language field isn't here because query doesn't care about it. So what we can do is write an elif statement and copy this data. But instead of query, we want EQL. And since we just discovered that EQL requires the language field, we could include that in there. And as a helpful note, what we can do is write a little comment showing that equal is event correlation. Okay, moving on to our next type that we care about. If we look in our example here, type threshold. So we're going to copy this whole chunk, type threshold. And what we can do is add that field in here. Okay. So now what happens is when this validation script imports whatever alert that we give it, it checks the type to make sure that the required fields are set properly, and then it'll go through and pipe out the missing fields. Okay, so let's test this. So in our previous test, we just ran it and made sure it had this subset, which we know and care about. And what we're going to do is delete language. So if we go here, it's an EQL type. Language is a required field. So let's go make sure this doesn't work. And we can hit run. And there we go. The following fields do not exist in the alert. And we forgot to put the name back in, but it looks like this works properly. And putting these pieces of data back in, we run it. So let's say we want to put some data in here and it's not required. What we can do is put in an else statement. And if we want, we could do something simple like that. Validation pass for file name. Okay, this concludes our very simple but very useful script to validate our required fields for the specific alert types that we care about. Please note that if you are using Elastic in a more comprehensive manner outside of this course, you are going to have to write more validation queries according to the documentation. There's only so many event types that you'd have to calculate into this required field section. Okay, but it'll all function the same. You just tack on whatever one you need. All right, that concludes this video. This is a good bit of Python. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next video.